As World War II came to an end, the decades to come would unravel the inhumane and heinous acts that were committed in the shadows of war. An estimated 200,000 women and girls were subjected to one of the most brutal and systematic abuses in world history. These women came to be known by the deceptively minimizing name comfort women. There is a scarcity of reliable records, says Korean scholar Maija Devine, but we will uncover the harsh realities these women faced and hear the stories of those who survived. The comfort system was an organized and horrific program of sexual enslavement by the Imperial Japanese Army. Young women and girls, some as young as 8 and 9, were taken from their families, deceived with promises of work, or coerced through threats of violence. They were transported to military brothels scattered across Japanese-occupied territories, where they faced relentless physical and psychological torment. These realities have been hidden by silence and denial for decades. The story of the comfort woman is not just a story of the horrors of war, but an ongoing struggle for acknowledgement, sincere apology, and reparations. Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to all of my patrons for making this show possible. I'm moving my patron shoutout to the end of each episode for a more pleasant listening experience. Korean True Crime's logo sticker tier is now in the vault on Patreon, but don't fret, there is a new sticker available now. You can get a new sticker every 3 months if you join us on Patreon now. Link is in the description. You can also watch Korean True Crime on YouTube again with behind-the-scenes footage of me recording the episode with photographs contextualizing. Lastly, join us on Discord for movie nights of films based off of the real crimes covered in each episode. Link is in the description. With that, let us begin. Warning. Today's episode contains testimonies that detail systematic sexual assault and sexual slavery. Listener discretion is advised. In the year 1919, the Japanese military was dispatched to Siberia as part of the Siberian Intervention. Of the 7 divisions sent, 1 was taken down, but not from bombs or bullets, but instead from a wave of sexually transmitted diseases, from local sex workers, and from raping civilians. This was not an isolated incident. Japanese authorities began to receive many reports that soldiers were falling ill from the rapid spread of STDs. This posed a significant problem, not just for the soldiers' health, but for the already tarnished reputation of the Japanese Imperial Army. Following the infamous rape of Nanjing, in which 80,000 women and children were sexually assaulted by Japanese soldiers, Japan desperately wanted to improve their image. Sexual violence was quickly becoming associated with Japanese soldiers. In an effort to stop the spread of disease and prevent any further anti-Japanese sentiment, the military had the idea to create military brothels called comfort stations. They couldn't control their soldiers' violent sexual urges, so they decided to provide a safe environment for them to access sex workers. That was the idea anyways. These brothels would keep the soldiers away from civilians and help mend the reputation in the countries that they were occupying. The term comfort women comes from the Japanese word yanfu, which was coined by Okamura Yasuji, a vice chief in the Japanese military Shanghai Expeditionary Force. It was meant to make the job of a military sex worker seem less lascivious. Because this term has been used to diminish the violence these women experienced, I will not be calling them comfort women. I will refer to these women as what they were: victims of military sexual slavery, survivors, and when I can, their names. The first of these brothels was opened in Manchuria during the Manchurian Incident in 1931. By 1932, following the first Shanghai incident, the first official comfort station was established, with the number of military brothels skyrocketing as the Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. There's a common misbelief that these comfort stations were created during World War II. However, they just became more common in areas that Japan occupied during World War II. The idea behind these comfort stations was to accomplish many goals. Firstly, they wanted to reduce the likelihood of soldiers raping civilians, which had been a great shame on their nation from previous incidents. They also wanted to control the spread of sexually transmitted diseases amongst the population. There was also a concern that soldiers intoxicated on booze or opium would have loose lips when speaking to sex workers, who could be spies undercover trying to learn military secrets. Okamura Yasuji himself admitted in a 1970 publication that he was one of the spearheaders in the Anfu Project to stop the widespread sexual assaults committed by their own soldiers, and that the presence of provided sex workers could significantly reduce these crimes. Although the reality of what happened in these comfort stations is far grimmer. From 1932 to the end of World War II, the Japanese government and Imperial Army forced over 200,000 women into sexual slavery across Asia. These comfort stations, more accurately military sexual slavery centers, had women taken mainly from Japan-occupied Korea, but also women from China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Burma, Russia, Vietnam, Taiwan, Laos, Malaysia, Cambodia, Papua New Guinea, Thailand, Dutch East Indies, and Japan as well were taken. Anywhere the Imperial Army went, women were taken. By 1938, over 70 comfort stations were operating in China alone, with more than 1,000 women documented from Korea and China. The stations were growing quickly in numbers. A military document recruiting women for these stations that was sent in 1937 states that unmarried women in Korea shall be used to supply the military's special business, alongside a specification that Korean men would also be recruited into labor for Japan's mines and factories. Specifically, they were looking for women who had already worked in sex work, or had their parents agree to send them to the brothels. In early 1938, Japan hired agents to scour Japan and Korea for 3,000 women to send to Shanghai. They received criticism from the Japanese police for the methods that they used to recruit the women, which the nation's police called kidnapping. The Japanese Police Bureau came forward and stated that any women taken for this program must be over the age of 21, which many of the girls prior to this had not been. If this rule was followed, it was only followed for a short while in the recruitment of Japanese women, if it was followed at all. By July 1941, following the start of Japan's involvement in World War II, the Japanese military's plans to recruit 200,000 women from Korea was nowhere near completed. With pressure to supply the comfort stations with more and more women, the recruiting military agents had to resort to more violent methods, including outright kidnapping. The most common tactic employed by these agents was a fake job advertisement promising legitimate work to young women. The pay they advertised was better than the factories, and they'd have to travel abroad for the job, meaning that anyone who applied was likely poor, desperate, and willing to be separated from their families. They wanted vulnerable women to essentially identify themselves. Months later, in December 1941, more comfort stations had been built in other occupied territories, including Taiwan. Military documents reveal that many of the women being recruited at this time were only aged 18 to 19 and had no record of being involved in prior sex work. Although it is important to note that involvement in sex work does not mean that any of these women would have consented to be military sexual slaves or that they deserved any violence that came to them. Sex workers also reserve the right to revoke consent and choose their clients. By September 3, 1942, the Japanese military had established an extensive network of these stations. According to reports, there was approximately 400 comfort stations scattered across Asia. According to reports, there were approximately 400 comfort stations in just China. The Philippines had 30, Burma had 50, and Indonesia 40. Additionally, Okinawa saw the establishment of 130 small stations in 1942 alone. The intended purpose of these comfort stations was to cater to the needs of Japanese soldiers, but the reality was very far from this official narrative. The lack of oversight of this program and the loose monitoring of the stations meant that the soldiers could essentially run the stations how they wanted. It's most likely that the official rules for this program were more a suggestion or just a way that they could document that they weren't doing anything wrong while not actually following those rules. Official estimates based on research suggest that 20,000 to 400,000 were forced into these horrific comfort stations. These figures are based off of calculations derived from military personnel numbers and estimated ratios. But the women and girls often moved stations, and many women died in these stations, which wasn't reported, so accurate numbers can't be known. Korean activist Kim Il-myeon asserts that 80 to 90% of these women were Korean, totaling approximately 170 to 200,000 people. However, China has also argued that a majority of the women in comfort stations in China were Chinese women and girls. Nationalities aside, none of these women and girls deserved this, and every single one of them mattered. The horrors endured by these women were documented in various ways. The 1998 report by Gay J. McDougall, a special reporter for the United Nations, labeled these comfort stations as rape camps, emphasizing the systematic nature of the abuse. McDougall's report aimed to address the pervasive sexual violence and slavery, calling for acknowledgement of the profound injuries inflicted on the victims. The report underscored the need for justice and reparations, insisting that history must not downplay the atrocities committed. A racist Japanese song from World War II illustrates the dehumanization and mockery faced by these women. The song is known as the Mantetsu song. It is a crude and offensive reflection of the widespread prejudice and belittling of the victims. Depictions like this serve to dehumanize the victims of sexual abuse further, treating their pain as entertainment. Mantetsu was actually the Japanese railway company in Manchuria, so the song is about a railway worker visiting a brothel. Thank you to user Crosswam on Reddit for providing a translation of this song. The song in context is sang in a mocking Korean accent that Japan deemed as unintelligent. The translated song reads, "At a night when the rain is falling, from out the glass window, a Mantetsu golden-buttoned idiot is peeking in. To touch is 50 sen, to watch is free. If you give me 3 yen and 50 sen, I will go with you until the morning. Make up your mind and decide if you will come up or go home. If you decide to enter, pick up your wooden clogs and come up. Dear customer, at this time, there is a pimp asking a high price. Come and tip 50 sen quickly. So hold me and lay down, and I will give you 2 or 3 freebies. Until the morning, you can use my body. I was tricked. I thought it was a 50 sen gold coin, but it turned out to be the cap of a beer bottle. I was tricked." That is the song. I did censor a derogatory word for women's genitals in this song, but the meaning still stands. This song is supposed to be about a Korean comfort woman singing about the men coming to the comfort station with 50 sen, which a sen coin is comparable to a cent in US dollars. 1 sen is 100th of a yen. So this song implies that the women cost 50 cents to touch and $3.50 to have sex with. Another Reddit user, Postal History, contextualized this song for us. The Mantetsu song is akin to a minstrel song from the era of US slavery, where depictions of Africans happily enslaved were used for comedy. This song, however, kind of inverts that dynamic. It highlights the cruel treatment of Korean women under Japanese rule, reflecting how Japanese viewed Koreans as inferior and thoroughly enjoyed the suffering of Korean women. Just as there are very few narratives or books capturing the African American community's perspective on minstrel depictions due to the dominance of white America's control over the press, a similar suppression occurred for Koreans. During Japan's occupation of Korea, Koreans had absolutely no option to publish their own media or voice their experiences publicly. That is oppression. The Reddit user Postal History states this in the song that the phrase 50 cent was sang with a mocking Korean accent, which has been used in the past as a way to distinguish and kill Korean people during the 1923 Kento massacre. It's important to note that while the focus of this episode and this podcast is on Korea, Japan was treating many other Asian countries the same way, with the same prejudice, especially China. By 1943, comfort stations were built in Okinawa and Indonesia as well. The majority of women who were targeted came from poor families. Many of the women and girls that were taken while they are away from their households, sometimes at work. Sometimes the families even sent their daughters to work these jobs with the promise that their daughters would be returned when they were of a marriable age, because no one knew that this was brothel work. They genuinely thought these girls were going to be like nursing assistants or office workers, sometimes even like just cooking in the kitchen or mending clothes for the soldiers. Some women and girls reported that their families sold them to the Japanese military. Very, very few of these women willingly went to work in the brothels, although undoubtedly there probably were a few. It may have been the only way that some of these women could find income, even if that income was just barely enough to feed themselves rice every day. Before we get into the testimonies of some of the survivors and learn about what life was like in these camps, it's important that we learn a tradition that gives insight to the Confucian dogma that Korea believes. Korea has had a significant influence from Confucianism that stems from the early Joseon period, beginning in 1392. You can see the influence of Confucianism today in Korean government, cultural norms, and the justice system. Victims of wartime rape in Confucian societies faced ostracization due to the Confucian belief that women must remain virgins until marriage. Sexual violence has been used throughout wars as a way to disgrace the women of the enemy country, which explains why the women who suffered within these brothels were not able to come forward easily and tell their stories. According to scholar Maida E. Devine, the deep-rooted Confucian beliefs play a crucial role in understanding the experiences of Korean women in the comfort stations. Confucian teachings emphasized the importance of chastity before marriage and unwavering loyalty to their husband, even after his death. It was this emphasis placed on a woman's virginity that led women and even young girls to carry small knives in their clothing known as eunjangdo, or a small knife that fits in the palm of your hand. Eunjangdo were not simple pocket knives. Rather, they were typically beautifully crafted. They had beautiful craftsmanship and artwork on the sheaths. Sometimes they were even hidden inside small brooches or hairpins. These were not only for self-defense though, but they also had a really dark purpose. If a woman were raped, she was expected to turn that knife onto herself, to save her family and her husband the shame of her not being loyal to him any longer. And if the girl was a virgin, then it was because she no longer was valuable. Though these chastity knives have long since fallen out of use, some blacksmiths continued to make these traditional knives throughout the Japanese occupation, trying to keep their traditions alive. To adapt them to everyday use, they could even be purchased with a set of personal chopsticks inside the sheath. Having an eunjangdo meant that you were a loyal wife, or that you protected your virginity for your future husband. You were a good woman. Everything that we know about the sexual slaves taken by Japan, we can attribute to the bravery of one woman. The immense shame that surviving women felt kept them silent. And to the Japanese government, it was all just a part of war. To most of the world, sex crimes during war is just collateral damage. World War II may have ended in 1945, but it wasn't until 1991, 46 years later, that the first Korean woman, Kim Hak-sun, found the courage to tell her story. This doesn't mean the existence of comfort stations was unknown, but it was an incredibly taboo topic. The more it was treated as taboo, the more pressure there was on survivors to remain silent. Kim Hak-sun was born in 1924 in China after her Korean parents fled Japanese-occupied Korea. Her father was an activist supporting the Independence Army, but he died when she was just 3 months old. Her mother brought her to Pyongyang, Korea, where she was from. At the age of 14, her mother remarried, but Kim Hak-sun faced disagreements with her stepfather, which led to her mother sending her to a foster home. The foster family owned a business where they were training kiseng, an ancient profession where girls aged 16 to 22 were trained to be courtesans, skilled in dance, conversation, and musical talents. Historically, kiseng played crucial roles in independence struggles and political demonstrations. However, under Japanese occupation, the profession was devalued, and Japanese police became pimps, forcing the skilled women into sex work, which the origins of kisengs did include sex work as well. This story parallels the Japanese geisha, as the professions are very similar. Kim Hak-sun attended a kiseng academy until she was 17, learning to entertain through song, storytelling, and dance. Upon graduation, she faced the harsh reality that she was too young to receive her kiseng license because you had to be 19 due to the sexual nature of the job. She returned home to her mother and stepfather because she had nowhere else to go. Her stepfather took her and another girl that they had taken in to China, where they were sold to a Japanese soldier and sent to a comfort station. As soon as she arrived, she was told, "Your name is no longer Kim Hak-sun. Your name is Aiko," a Japanese name. The officer told her that if she didn't obey him, he would kill her. She was told that she was now a hygienic tool used by the Japanese soldiers to satisfy their sexual desires. Soldiers would line up at the brothel every day, and the sexual abuse she endured was horrific. She saw other women and girls at the station murdered by soldiers who visited them. She even saw some girls take their own lives. After just 4 months, a Korean merchant helped her escape. She married this man and had 2 children before returning to Seoul in 1945. Tragically, one of her children died in a cholera outbreak as they were forced to live in a refugee camp for months after their return. Though her husband appeared to be her savior, Kim Hak-sun revealed that he was a violent drunk who had raped her before helping her escape. He often abused her and mocked her by referencing her time working in sexual slavery as a way to devalue her and belittle her. Throughout her life, Kim Hak-sun heard about women like her described as disgraceful. This stigma was so intense that no woman dared tell their story. However, as Korea became more democratic in the late 1980s, difficult topics like rape began to be acknowledged. In 1990, the Japanese government denied responsibility for having these sexual slavery centers. This infuriated Kim Hak-sun, who knew she had to break the silence. At 67, she boldly declared, "I will say what I have to say," condemning those who looked down upon survivors of sexual slavery. She also condemned Korean people as well, who still supported Japan, brainwashed by years of colonization. Following her testimony, more victims came forward, leading to a lawsuit demanding reparations and an apology from the Japanese government. Civilians came forward in Japan to disagree with their government's treatment of women in the past, creating the Asian Women's Fund, which offered reparations to these women. Still, Kim Hak-sun rejected the money and sought restitution instead. She didn't want the people's money. If anyone was going to give money to the victims, it should have been the government. Her testimony helped establish the Wednesday demonstration, which you may have heard of before. It's a weekly protest in Korea in front of the Japanese embassy that continues to this day. Kim Hak-sun taught the world details of what happened inside of these brothels. Despite paperwork claiming women had to be over 21, many of the girls were as young as 11, some as young as 8 or 9. Only about 25% of women survived the comfort stations. This statistic is based off a quote from Seijiro Arifune of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, who stated that during the war, these women were essentially stripped of their identities and treated as Japanese property. The comfort stations operated under a ticket system, where soldiers purchased tickets to visit the women, who were promised a portion of the money in return. These tickets were similar to the ration tickets that they received. They could purchase these tickets with their wages, and many men bought tickets in bundles. In many of the survivors' testimonies, the women recalled that these tickets were used to purchase short periods of time. Each ticket allotted the men around 30 minutes, but the men could also use multiple tickets to have more time. Some of the women who have come forward said that there were instances of soldiers falling in love with them and promising to run away with them or help them escape. It was always untrue. These kinds of soldiers still chose to rape them, even if they were deluded to think that it was love. However, some men did feel such sympathy for the girls that they purchased bundles of tickets just to sit in the room as the girls and give them a break, even for just a short few hours. Some soldiers brought them cigarettes or alcohol, occasionally a nice piece of food, a reprieve from the usual horrendous abuse and torture that the other soldiers did to them. These acts of kindness were too infrequent to give the women any real hope. Because the women and girls received wages based on how many tickets they collected, the system created an environment where the women saw each other as competition. Their earnings were so small that losing just one visitor to someone else could be the difference between eating that day or not. However, not all survivors said that they had to purchase their own food. Some comfort stations provided food to the women as part of their rations, whereas others lived entirely separate from the military and had to pay for their beds, clothes, and food. The remaining money they had was deposited into Japanese savings accounts for them. Still, the money was useless without identification, information about where this bank account was, or the ability to even leave their encampment. By the war's end, 110 billion yen had been deposited into Japanese bank accounts for these women, but none of these women would be able to retrieve any of that money. The money was seized and used to help Japan's failing economy after the end of the war. When the war ended, many women were left abandoned, unaware that the war had even ended, and unable to access their own money. Some Japanese soldiers brought the women back to Korea or wherever they were from, but many of these women were just stranded in a foreign country. Another such woman was Kaneda Kimiko, who was taken at just the age of 16. Kimiko was born in 1921 in Tokyo, Japan, to a Japanese mother and a Korean father. Shortly after her birth, her family relocated to Japanese-occupied Korea, where her father was working as a priest. However, he did not worship the Japanese religion of Shinto, rather he was loyal to his traditional Korean faith. When she turned 14, her father was arrested for violating religious laws, which mandated that all religious leaders conform to Japanese faith and visit Japanese shrines. To avoid further punishment, her father agreed he would bring all of his congregation to the shrines. But this was a lie. He never intended on following through with this and never did bring his congregation there, which led to him being caught once again. Kaneda Kimiko remembered her father coming home with large burn wounds on his legs from an encounter with the police. One night, hearing the sound of a police car approaching, she ran to warn her father, who then hid in a nearby field until the police left. Out of fear, he left their home and went to hide in the rural mountains with his sister. Kimiko learned to live her entire life afraid of the police. In 1938, at the age of 16, she got a job working as a housemaid, but the work was incredibly difficult and her employer was especially cruel. A friend of hers, Yoshiko, suggested that they go and apply for a new job that had been advertised in town for women to do cooking and mending work for the military. The pay was advertised as being much better than what they were making now, so it was very enticing to them. When they visited the employment office to learn more, that is when a soldier approached them and forced them onto a truck that took them to the train station. They were forced onto a train from Seoul to Tianjin, China. There were other girls on the train as well, huddled in fear of the armed soldiers guarding the exits. At their first stop, Kimiko and Yoshiko tried to leave the train secretly, but a soldier was covering every exit. Both of them had experienced and seen violence at the hands of the Japanese police. They knew that these police officers would not hesitate to shoot them if they tried to run. The train started again and took them to a station where they were forced onto another truck, which drove them to the comfort station at the military base in Zhaoqing, China. There were about 20 girls on the train around her age. They were divided into two groups, separating Kimiko and Yoshiko. Kimiko's group were led into an empty dining room at the comfort station and made to sit on the floor. The soldier leading them told them what their job would truly be. To her, it was as if she had been told she would be executed. The girls wept loudly throughout the night, unable to sleep on the cold dining room floor. The next morning, they were led to different, small curtained rooms that they were going to work in. Just minutes later, a soldier came into the room and without saying anything, grabbed Kimiko and tried to rip her clothes off. She screamed at the man to stop and leave as she kicked and punched him. The man did leave to go to another girl's room, but the second soldier to visit her that day wasn't any kinder. This man was already intoxicated and angry. He held a knife to her throat and threatened her to do as he said. In that moment, she says that she stopped fearing death. Death would be preferable to a life in sexual slavery. She tried fighting back against this man, which just angered him more. So he stabbed her in the chest and left her to bleed out. As she was carried to the infirmary, barely conscious, she could hear the man being gently scolded for stabbing one of the prostitutes. Because the sexual slaves received the bare minimum of medical treatment, her wounds healed very slowly and poorly, with infection-causing complications. She remained in the infirmary for 20 days before they determined she was healed enough to return to the brothel. Her wound was still bandaged and stitched when the next soldier came to her room. When he saw her bandages, he began to hit her, causing the stitches to open and bleed. She yelled at the man, and he threw her onto the ground and began kicking her arms, stomping on her wrists. She says the man stomped on her wrists until the skin was gone and she could see her bones. She thought she would lose both of her hands as she was carried again to the infirmary. The man had caused her to have 2 irreparable broken wrists, causing lifelong nerve damage. During both of her infirmary visits, pain medication was not offered. Kimiko, like many of the women and girls held in sexual slavery by the Imperial Army, had to manage the pain that they endured every day on their own. Soldiers' abuse, malnourishment, sexually transmitted diseases, all causing them pain every waking moment. And they had nothing to turn to other than alcohol, if they could afford it, and opium. Opium, in the early 1940s, had been a large source of revenue for the Chinese government. Although they were discouraging the use of it, they still profited heavily off of it. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is when Kimiko was brought to this comfort station, opium was taxed and sold to Japanese military bases. Income from the taxes on opium made up more than 40% of the CCP's revenue. Opium itself has a euphoric effect on the brain that has immediate relief for physical pain with a calm drowsiness and relaxation. Opium makes your body release endorphins that tricks your brain into believing that it feels calm, relaxed, and pain-free. With access to this drug, the victims of sexual slavery were kept content and controllable as their addiction to opium formed. Kimiko and the other girls endured more than 20 soldiers visiting them every day, beginning early in the morning and not ending until the sun rose the next day. They had very little time to sleep and had meager meals during whatever breaks they did have. Some of the girls next to Kimiko's room were even younger than she was, but they weren't allowed to speak to one another. A few of these girls she saw had not even started puberty yet. She says, these girls had just as long of lines as the women in their 20s. No one escaped the abuse of these soldiers. When the girls were injured by soldiers or suffered from sexually transmitted diseases, they were sent to the infirmary, as Kimiko had been many times. Even for her stab wound, no medicine was given to the slaves except antiseptic injections and cheap bandaging. The better medical supplies were reserved for the soldiers. If the slaves were taken in with a wound that needed to be disinfected, the nurses would use an antiseptic known as mercurochrome, which is a reddish-orange liquid that, when applied directly to the wound, stains the skin red, which means that infections and inflammation became incredibly difficult to distinguish. Although this was not a large concern of military doctors. Like hydrogen peroxide, mercurochrome was incredibly painful when applied, and later would be banned entirely because of the mercury content of the tincture was so high it caused blood toxicity levels that could kill patients who received it. It was also found to do almost nothing to improve the healing in wounds, and often just led to them getting worse. Bandages soaked in this liquid were placed on the open sores, genital tearing, and even stab wounds that the women and girls sustained without the relief of pain medication. Because of this antiseptic's ineffectiveness, these women and girls often fell ill from infections which became septic, causing their deaths. A new girl would be found to replace them shortly after their passing anyways, so the military really didn't care. This was before the Japanese Army had access to penicillin, including for soldiers, so this was the only medication they had. On top of this brutal medical treatment, the sexual slaves were also given an injection on a weekly basis to prevent pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. The injection was known as Compound 606. This compounded medicine was made from arspheniamine. The brand name was Salvarsan. This antibiotic drug was created to treat syphilis, which was an ongoing problem for the military. While this drug was groundbreaking in its time for making syphilis finally curable, receiving this medicine every week had horrific side effects. The arsenic in Compound 606 was too toxic for the human body to endure and would cause rigors, fevers, nausea, and cyanosis, which is where you lack oxygen in your blood and your body begins to turn blue. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The doses at which these girls were being given also acted as an abortifacient, which is how they used the medication to prevent pregnancy. They forced the girls to have miscarriages all the time. This is what led to sterilization and lifelong complications. Diseases spread easily through the brothels because of the close contact they had with so many men who rarely bathed. Tuberculosis became a deadly illness that was going through all of the camps. If any of the girls had tuberculosis, the only thing that they could do was have them go outside more often for fresh air. But that didn't work for many of the malnourished and injured young girls. Kimiko says that she heard the younger girls weep in the middle of the night until the soldiers got sick of it and dug a deep trench outside of the camp and forced all of the sick women and girls into the hole to air out their illness. The next morning, when one of the girls had died, one of the authorities decided to cover the trench and begin pumping poison gas inside until all of the girls were dead to end the tuberculosis. They made the Chinese labor slaves dig a new trench, continuing the cycle until tuberculosis was gone. As the war continued, they started to lose more and more staff, including nurses who fell ill just as the others had. Some of the older slaves were brought to the infirmary to assist injured soldiers. Kaneda Kimiko was trained to give injections to the gravely injured soldiers. As these soldiers died, she said not a single one of them muttered their banzai cry for Japan. Instead, many of them kissed pictures of their families or prayed to see their family in the afterlife. As they died, the war no longer mattered to them. Kimiko was held as a slave for 7 years, from the age of 16 to just after her 24th birthday. But then, in 1945, as the war came to an end, the military camp suddenly was abandoned and the sexual slaves were able to just walk out of the front doors. She found her way back to Korea and was taken to a refugee camp where she was able to receive medical treatment. She had sustained injuries and infections bad enough that they had to perform an emergency hysterectomy. Thankfully, she survived this surgery and continued to live in Korea. In 1997, at the age of 76, she became one of the first recipients of the Asian Women's Fund. Kaneda Kimiko passed away in 2005 at the age of 84. Many more women have come forward to tell their story, including Lee Young-soo, who was born in Daegu, Korea in 1928. When she was 15 in 1943, her and her friend were approached by a Japanese soldier when they were catching snails by a riverbank. Without warning, Kimiko and her friend were forcibly taken to a train that took them to a dock in Anju, Korea. It was on this boat that Young-soo learned that they were going to Taiwan to work at a kamikaze military camp. Even before getting off of the boat, Young-soo experienced her first sexual assault by a soldier. Her story is just one of many that reveal many of these women and girls were raped even before they reached the comfort stations. Officers responsible for recruiting and transporting the military sex slaves often claimed the first right to rape them. Some girls, realizing what would await them, chose to jump from the trains or ships, preferring death over a life of sexual slavery. Upon arrival at the comfort station, Young-soo saw the terrifying reality. She was subjected to sexual violence every day without respite, even during menstruation. Her suffering extended beyond sexual abuse. Beatings, knife cuts, and electric torture were a part of her daily existence here. Escape seemed impossible. She had nowhere to go and no means to survive outside the station, even if she could escape. Young-soo vividly remembers the soldiers who visited her. Many of them were teens, age 17 or 18, trained as kamikaze pilots or soldiers who faced imminent death. On the nights before their kamikaze missions, these young men would come to her, some weeping loudly. Not all of the men mistreated her, and she holds onto the memory of those who showed her kindness in a cruel world. These young soldiers, sent to die for a cause that they barely comprehended, often sought comfort in their final moments. Their sadness has never left her memory. After the war ended and Young-soo was liberated from the camp, she returned to her home in Daegu. But when she saw her family and told them what had happened to her, they rejected her and told her to leave. She couldn't have known that many of the other women had experienced this form of isolation after they returned. So she lived alone, in silence about what had happened to her, hoping to remove that stain from her past. That is, until she saw Kim Hak-sun's brave testimony on TV. She mulled over the decision to reveal her own story, and finally, in June 1982, she registered with the Korean government as a former comfort woman, becoming the 29th to do so. She felt a great weight off of her shoulders and decided to live her life to the fullest. She returned to school and earned her master's degree in 2001. From then on, she said she would never be silent again and traveled the world recounting her painful experience so that others could do the same. She spoke in front of the United States Congress even and declared, "I am an honorable daughter of Korea. I am not a comfort woman." Despite her testimony, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe denied Japan's culpability and dismissed all former apologies as unnecessary. Young-soo continued her fight against Japan's attempts to erase its shameful history, even meeting Pope Francis to ask him to help their cause. Like Young-soo, many of the victims felt alone in their experience until they were able to come together to share their stories. Another woman, Kim Bok-dong, like Young-soo, felt compelled to come forward when she heard Kim Hak-sun's story. Born in Yangsan, Korea in 1925, Kim Bok-dong grew up only knowing Japanese occupation, much like the other victims. As World War II began and Japan increased their drafting efforts for the Imperial Army, she watched as high school students were being taken to fight in the war. By 1939, when Kim Bok-dong was 14, a Japanese soldier came for her. The soldier told her she was going to be sent to work in a factory making uniforms for the soldiers. They claimed the factories were desperate for workers and assured her mother she would be returned before she was of marrying age. However, the underlying threat was clear. Refusal could mean death for their entire family. Bok-dong and 30 other girls aged preteen to 20 were loaded onto an open-backed military truck. Days later, they were herded onto a boat bound for Taiwan. Bok-dong was too young to realize that there was no uniform factory. In Taiwan, the girls were moved onto a boat headed to Guangdong, China. When they finally arrived in China, they were greeted by a high-ranking Japanese military official who asked each of them individually their age. Kim Bok-dong and some of the other girls were younger than 15, which the officer scowled at. After he whispered to some of the other soldiers about the girls being maybe too young for the job, they dismissed the concerns and agreed that they could do it. Bok-dong was wondering what kind of factory machinery she was going to have to work on. Some of the nurses came and took her and the other girls in for an examination before leading them to their rooms. This brothel seemed to be an old school building that had been repurposed. As they walked, Kim Bok-dong could see the inside of the windows and saw people having sex. This sight frightened her. At just 14, she didn't even know what sex was yet. As they reached the dorms, a soldier dragged her inside, hitting and assaulting her. She returned to the dorm, blood running down her legs. The other girls were huddled together, crying and bleeding as well. One of the girls her age mentioned that they would be better off dead and talked about using alcohol to kill themselves. Alcohol, however, was not cheap. Kim had 1 Korean won, which due to Japanese colonization was equivalent to 1 Japanese yen, which was a lot more than the Chinese currency. It was a very small amount of money, however, just enough for her to buy food. She decided instead to use this money to kill herself. She called over a cleaning woman and handed her the single won, asking her to bring back the strongest alcohol she could find. The woman returned later with a 750 milliliter bottle of Kyalang liquor, which is known for its high alcohol content, which typically has 58% alcohol by volume. Bok-dong and 3 other girls started drinking the alcohol, mixed with some water to avoid vomiting. The alcohol burned their throats, but they continued to drink as much as they could until they all passed out. They were missing for too long, though, causing the guards to come looking for them. Eventually, they found the girls unconscious on the floor. Medics were called and the girls had their stomachs pumped. They all survived this suicide attempt, but were unconscious for 10 days in the infirmary. After this, Bok-dong suffered irreparable damage to her stomach that has pained her for the rest of her life. She decided that she truly wanted to live and knew that the only way to avoid the worst of the abuse was just to obediently listen to the guards. She hoped that this would be enough to survive. Starting on Saturdays from noon to 6 p.m., the men lined up in queues with their tickets. The men were given condoms and lubricant in small wooden boxes like a matchbook to protect the men from diseases. Some days, more than 30 men would visit her, and she would weep from the pain in her entire body. The medics would inspect the girls and treat them if needed each day before they returned to their sleeping quarters. On Sundays, the line would begin at 8 a.m. and didn't end until 5 p.m. Each comfort station operated differently, some more ruthless than others, however, all were inhumane. Kim Bok-dong's story did not end at the first comfort station. She was moved repeatedly from Guangdong to Hong Kong to Malaysia, Indonesia, and finally Singapore. She remained in Singapore until the war's end. As the war did come to an end, Japanese soldiers began destroying evidence of the comfort stations. They tried to cover up their atrocities by telling Bok-dong that she was a nurse at the army hospital and that was the story she had to stick to. Despite the war's official end, many Japanese soldiers stayed in East Asian countries, refusing to surrender and attempting to maintain their control. From 1945 to 1946, Bok-dong remained in Singapore and was forced to work as a nursing assistant for the Japanese military. When the U.S. Army finally did arrive, Bok-dong and the other prisoners were taken to a U.S. prison camp and held for a few days before being sent back to their home countries. They were considered refugees, finally receiving some form of aid. Soon, she stood in front of her family's house and knocked. It had been almost 8 years since she'd been gone. She was now 21. Her family had no idea what she had to endure. To them, she had gone to work in Japanese factories as they had been told. It wasn't until years later, when her mother questioned why she wasn't trying to get married, that Bok-dong finally told them the truth. Her mother pushed her until she finally confessed the heinous acts that she had suffered. The revelation was just too much for her mother to hear. In the shock, she suffered a fatal heart attack. Bokdong, re-traumatized by telling her story to her mother and seeing her mother die, repressed her story and emotions, unable to come forward until she was 60. That is when she heard the testimony of Kim Hak-sun. In an interview with Asian Boss, a news outlet, Bokdong addressed allegations that these women were paid sex workers for the Japanese military doing this willingly. She angrily said, "Is that what a 14-year-old does to make money? The evidence is all there, but Japan is trying to hide it." She explained how people often tried to silence her, refusing to believe her story or attempting to downplay it. When Park Geun-hye was president, she reached a deal to remove a comfort woman statue without consulting the victims and accepted reparation money, a move that went against everything these women fought for. Bokdong, like many others, longed for a sincere apology, but even their own government had very little sympathy for them. Despite her significant contributions to the cause, she regretted ever coming forward. She regretted it because how little the world seemed to care. Kim Bok-dong enjoyed the saying, "Hate the sin, not the sinner." She understood that the atrocities were committed by a former empire, not the current Japanese government. She hoped for some relief before her death. However, Kim Bok-dong passed away on January 28, 2019 after battling cancer, leaving behind a legacy of bravery and resilience. In 2005, a North Korean woman named Park Young-sim was interviewed about her time being held in a comfort station. Young-sim lived with her father and stepmother when she was little, but her family was poor. Her father chose to sell her to a tailor shop to work as a maid at just the age of 14. She worked at the tailor shop for 3 years until the age of 17. In 1938, a Japanese businessman came to the store and said, "I have a job for you." She tried to resist, but the man forced her onto a truck and drove her to the train station. She was put onto the train with other women and girls taken to Nanjing, China, specifically the Golden Canal Comfort Station. When we see pictures of old comfort stations, some of which the buildings still stand to this day, it is immensely emotional to see how similarly dehumanizing it was to a concentration camp. In one instance, a comfort station had a large sign erected that read "Public Bathroom" in Japanese. Other signs were deceiving and said, "Welcome to the so-and-so house," in a more upscale design as if this was a luxury brothel. As Young-sim came to the building, which she described as a 3-story brick house with 2 by 2.5 meter rooms like a dormitory, she felt chills up her spine. Each room had a single bed, no other furniture. She was put in one of the small rooms and the door closed. She sat on the bed wondering what would happen next to her. Then, a Japanese soldier came in the room and began to rape her. From that day on, she had lines around the corner. When she was in great pain and tried to ask for a break, the men or the guards would hurt her. Park Young-sim, like many of the other women, were given access to opium to ease their suffering, but also to keep them complacent, which made them easier to control. Young-sim says, "I couldn't die even if I wanted to, and I couldn't live even if I wanted to." Young-sim lived in constant terror of the Japanese soldiers, who frequently mocked and tormented the girls. She remembered a ruthless encounter with one of the soldiers. One day, one of the soldiers approached her and said, "You haven't had a proper meal today, so I'll treat you to some meat soup." True to his word, he brought her and the other girls some meat stew. She was starved for any form of nourishment that wasn't the plain rice that she was given every day, so she ate the soup. But as he collected the bowls, him and the other soldiers started to laugh and taunted her. "Don't you know what you just ate? We made that soup from Korean girls like you." Initially, she hoped that this was a grotesque joke, but the reality sank in when she later witnessed a Korean girl being beaten and dragged to a large cooking pot and boiled alive. After the war, Young-sim managed to return to Korea with the help of a Chinese citizen, but she found that no family was waiting for her. She had to rebuild her life from scratch. The experiences at the comfort station left her with lifelong health issues, including the need for a hysterectomy, heart valve surgery, and treatment for severe PTSD. She expressed that she could not find peace until she had let go of her grudge. Young Shim, originally from an area of North Korea, remains there to this day. We don't have any updates on her well-being, but I hope she was able to find peace. These testimonies are only a few of the women who have come forward as survivors of the horrors that occurred inside of these military brothels. In a bonus episode on Patreon, we will cover more of the women's stories from Korea and other nations from which women were taken. Despite the end of World War II, many of these military brothels remained open. In 2007, the Associated Press reviewed historical documents pertaining to these comfort stations, uncovering previously untranslated and unreviewed materials. These documents revealed that as American forces occupied various cities at the war's end, Japan offered these comfort stations to the American troops. Shockingly, American authorities permitted the use of the official brothel system, despite there being reports indicating that these women were indeed slaves. Instead of utilizing existing comfort stations, however, Japan established new ones. The first brothel for U.S. troops was created in Atsugi, north of Tokyo, under Japan's government-operated and funded Recreation and Amusement Association. This comfort station, called the Babe Garden, initially had 38 women but quickly expanded to house 100 women, each reportedly receiving around 60 soldiers a day. The leader of a police department northeast of Tokyo in Ibaraki recalled converting a police dormitory into a makeshift brothel with bedding provided by the Navy to accommodate 20 military sex slaves. The brothel opened on September 20th, 1945, and immediately saw lines of U.S. troops waiting their turn, with more than 500 soldiers standing on the street. Soldiers did remark that the women were uninterested and resisted selling themselves to men who had been their enemies only a week before. They attributed the women's resistance to them not wanting to sleep with Americans. However, these women also considered Japan to be their enemy. The U.S. troops, however, did not speak Japanese, Korean, or Chinese and struggled to communicate with the women and girls if the women and girls tried to speak to them. The women, apprehensive at first, gradually just had to accept their situation as they were paid significantly more than under Japanese military, but they also couldn't leave. They were being held as slaves. There was nothing they could do about their situation. Records showed that these women were not former sex workers. They were not volunteers. They were tricked into military sex slavery. One of the survivors was Natsue Takira, who was 19 at the time. She had applied for a job as an office worker, but was told upon arrival that she would be a comfort woman. Coerced into accepting the job, she felt she couldn't say no. More women began applying to these deceptive job positions, which were advertised as having great pay and easy work. By the end of 1945, over 350,000 U.S. troops were occupying Japan. And records from the Recreation and Amusement Association show that more than 70,000 women were working in these brothels. Japanese historians now believe that these numbers may be underestimated, with many more women being involved. GIs paid for access to the brothel. One ticket, costing about 15 yen, or about a US dollar, bought them 30 minutes of time with the girl. This is around half the cost of a pack of cigarettes. This is also much more expensive than the cost of a brothel that the Japanese soldiers were accessing. The U.S. government provided Japan with shipments of penicillin specifically for these comfort stations, along with condoms and other prophylactics. Initially, it was believed that soldiers and authorities were unaware that these women were coerced or forced to work in the brothels. However, a December 1945 memorandum from Lieutenant Colonel Hugh MacDonald, a senior officer with the Public Health and Welfare Division, recorded otherwise. It stated, The girl is impressed into contracting by the desperate financial strains of her parents and their urging, occasionally supplemented by her willingness to make such a sacrifice to help her family. Essentially, they chose women and girls from impoverished families. The memorandum continued, "It is the belief of our informants, however, that in urban districts, the practice of enslaving girls still exists. Due to complaints from U.S. military authorities who feared public knowledge of these brothels would bring embarrassment to America, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the closure of these establishments to U.S. troops on March 25, 1946. Japan ended the Recreation and Amusement Association shortly after. This decision revealed that over a fourth of all American troops in Japan had contracted sexually transmitted diseases, and more than 150,000 Japanese women were left destitute, suffering from these venereal diseases as well. By 1993, the UN's Global Tribunal on Violations of Women's Human Rights estimated that about 90% of the women forced into military sex slavery during World War II had died, many from infections, health complications due to abuse, or by taking their own lives. On August 4th, 1993, the Japanese government finally acknowledged the extent of their involvement in establishing comfort stations during World War II. They recognized the lack of personal and sexual autonomy experienced by these women who were treated as property, essentially admitting that these were indeed sex slaves. By July 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's ending, the Japanese government issued a public apology for the comfort women issue. Prime Minister Tomichi Murayama stated, "I offer my profound apology to all of those who, as wartime comfort women, suffered emotional and physical wounds that can never be closed." In response, the Japanese people established the Asian Women's Fund to protect women's human rights in Japan and globally. This organization supports NGOs that aid women internationally, allowing donations from Japanese civilians to be directed specifically to comfort women as a means of atonement. However, the Japanese government has argued that individual comfort women have no right to compensation, claiming that their needs should be satisfied by the treaties Japan signed after the war. Despite the apologies, Japan continued to deny legal liability for the military's actions in establishing the comfort stations. They contended that the crime of slavery did not accurately describe the comfort stations, and even if it did, the prohibition of slavery was not established internationally until after World War II. Therefore, they asserted, international laws cannot be retroactive, absolving them of legal responsibility for what they did in the past. Additionally, acts of rape and armed conflict were not explicitly prohibited by international law until after World War II, and the laws of war applied only between warring nations. Because Japan was not at war with Korea, it wasn't breaking international law. In 1996, the Japanese government declared a statute of limitations on all civil and criminal cases related to their comfort stations. Despite the Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and Korea, which was signed in 1965, it was only then that the Korean government publicly acknowledged what had happened and requested reparations. Japan did comply, however, and asked Korea to provide a list of individuals to compensate or to distribute the funds themselves. Korea chose to take the lump sum, approximately $800 million in USD. But Prime Minister Kim Jong-pil spent the money on economic development rather than fulfilling the promise to victims and their families. No money was distributed to comfort women or their families. Prime Minister Kim Jong-pil claimed that there was no promise to compensate the victims directly, leading to lawsuits against the Korean government by the comfort women and other Korean people. Japan maintained that the funds they had given were intended as reparations, while Korea argued otherwise. Since then, 4 different Japanese leaders have addressed and apologized for the issue, the most recent being Shinzo Abe in 2015, who offered $8 million to Korea. This small amount was intended as a gesture to end discussions about Korean women. Park Geun-hye accepted the offer, agreeing that strengthening their alliance against China was crucial. However, Abe's apology came with a controversial request. He wanted to remove a comfort woman statue across from the Japanese embassy in Korea. This bronze statue depicts a young woman wearing traditional Korean clothing, hanbok, known as the Peace Monument. There are copies of this statue all over Korea, and it is highly respected by Korean people, who place flowers on the woman's lap and scarves around her neck in the winter. This particular statue was the focal point of weekly protests by Korean groups. It should also be noted that Abe had in the past denied the existence of comfort women and made dismissive comments about the women wanting reparations, so his apology didn't really mean much to comfort women anyways. In the end, the statue was not removed, but Park Geun-hye's acceptance of reparation money on behalf of the victims without conferring with them angered the Korean people. Many of the 35 international groups which focus on aiding World War II sexual slavery victims seek an apology akin to Germany's that they did for their victims. In the 1970s, German Chancellor Willy Brandt knelt to beg forgiveness for his country's atrocities, an act of humility and sincerity that Koreans yearn for from Japan. A large portion of this dismissal of the treatment of comfort women comes from the fact that Japan controlled all forms of media production, including printing presses, in all of the countries that they occupied during the war. They were able to invent the narrative. Then, when they were liberated, the Confucian dogma of many of these countries prevented the women from empowering themselves and telling their own stories. A U.S. soldier's report following the war's end described the liberated prisoners on the Burma border as camp followers. This report has been used to deny the suffering of these women, suggesting that they were voluntarily following the soldiers to make money. Historians acknowledge that while this may have occurred at some military bases, camp followers are usually family members of the soldiers. This was certainly not what was happening inside the comfort stations. The majority of these women were not volunteers, but captives. Even if they initially signed up for the jobs, the fact that they couldn't leave, endured abuse at the hands of the soldiers and the guards, meant that they were sexual slaves. Kim Hyun-suk, a historical researcher, explains that Japan's denial or disdain for Korea's unwillingness to forgive or forget what happened at comfort stations is deeply rooted in Japan's self-victimization following the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombings. While these bombings were devastating, there's no arguing that, they don't negate Japan's long role as a colonizer of many Asian nations that suffered greatly under their rule. The narrative of Japan as a victim of the bombings should not overshadow the immense suffering they inflicted on others during their imperial expansion. Both of these parts of history are true and can be understood within their own context. Despite Japan's history with Korea and the animosity that has characterized the relationship between the two nations, not all Japanese people shared in this prejudice. There were many people who reached out to the Asian Women's Fund to offer their own compassion and humanity. They sent heartfelt letters and donations apologizing for their own ancestors. The existence of comfort stations was hidden from civilians, making it an unfathomable truth for a lot of people. Many people just couldn't accept the truth. It was too shocking. They also just couldn't believe that something that evil could truly have happened. This is much like the shock people experienced when the reality of concentration and internment camps became known. This resulted in some people refusing to accept the truth, leading to history deniers. These are a few of the letters that were sent in. The first anonymous writer says, "Because I believe that actions are more important than words, I want to express my heartfelt apologies to the women who were forced to lead miserable lives as comfort women. I pray they will find peace and happiness. I cannot help much, but it will help to relieve the burden in my heart that I feel as a Japanese citizen." Another letter read, "I was only a child during the war, but when I later learned about comfort women and tried to imagine their humiliation, I shook with rage at the troops who carried out this inhumane scheme. I believe that every Japanese citizen should make amends for this crime on an individual basis. I would like you to use this donation to help the former comfort women recover their honor and dignity. However, this does not absolve the Japanese government of responsibility, so at the same time, please continue to uncover the historical facts. A war veteran wrote, "As a former soldier, I am contributing a portion of my military pension. However, I would like to say that only those who are there can truly understand the mentality of the battlefield. I do not want you to think lightly of our experience." A daughter of one of these war veterans also wrote, "My father is now 77 years old and fought in Manchuria and Okinawa. I pray for the success of your fund. There are many women who are still suffering. In addition, I hope you can help the fatherless children in all of the Asian nations who are the victims of irresponsible Japanese men during World War II." As of 2016, 238 women were registered to receive government subsidies for their time as a comfort woman. But this number does not capture all of the victims of this heinous program. Many of these women have passed away, kept their pasts hidden, or never even returned to Korea. Additionally, it's likely that many returned to their homes in what is now North Korea and cannot register with the South Korean program. The courageous act of these women coming forward has ignited widespread discussions about this dark chapter of history, particularly in Japan. Many Japanese citizens, moved by a sense of responsibility and remorse, had participated in the Asian Women's Fund. The heartfelt letters and donations sent to the fund are a testament to this acknowledgement and the citizens' apology. Despite these efforts, the pain and anger remain real. Regular protests and demonstrations continue outside of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, with people demanding recognition and accountability for the comfort stations and past war crimes. The wounds are still fresh, and their grudges run deep. When discussing such a distant and often undocumented part of history, we rely heavily on the testimonies of the witnesses and victims. The oral histories of comfort women, much like those of Black slaves and Holocaust survivors, are invaluable. We must listen to those who suffered and understand their stories. Shaped by intense emotions and sometimes incomplete, they're still true. Memories might fade with time, but trauma can also act as a cement. Survivors of these military sex slavery camps have faced criticism, accused of giving false testimony to receive compensation. Yet, as these brave women have shown, compensation was rarely, if ever, received. They feared speaking out due to the potential backlash from their own communities, and there was no tangible benefits from them sharing these painful stories. The main message here is we need to listen to victims. Even reconstructions of events in the Holocaust Memorial Hall based on victims' testimonies highlight the limitations of memory. Victims often don't even have the full picture since they were isolated from the rest of the world during their suffering. Survivor interviews and testimonies are not comprehensive histories. They're fragments of traumatic events. They provide us a framework of what truly happened. This does not make these survivors unreliable witnesses. I know that this episode might bring out deniers or attempts to downplay the severity of what happened during World War II, particularly the rape and abuse suffered by military sex slaves. I know that I'm going to receive hate for this episode, but if you've made it this far, you are probably not one of those people. If you want to hear more testimonies from women who have survived these comfort stations, I'll be doing another short bonus episode on Patreon. As always, thank you for listening to Korean True Crime. Join us on Discord for movie nights, find sources on Patreon for free, join our quarterly sticker club on Patreon, follow the show wherever you listen from, and please give me a rating. It helps the show quite a lot. Thank you to my patrons, Vix Mac, Lala, William White, Jean Juan Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, My96, Lumos, Emma Brown, David DeFoya, Adriana, Pip, Dade512, Lisa, Veronica, Olive, Caitlin, and Missy G. Daumay toppayo. See you next time.